Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Fearless Society podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about how God is all present and how God is all knowing. So I'm excited for you to join us in this conversation, and we hope you're blessed.
You're listening to the Fearless Society podcast, and we're building a community of fearless Christians who boldly live out the call that God has placed in our lives. We aren't afraid to talk about who we are and what we believe. Following Jesus today isn't easy, but it is worth it. And our goal is to come alongside you as we encourage and equip each other to live boldly and fearlessly, because a fearless church begins with us. Together, we are the Fearless Society. All right, so last episode, we talked about how God is all powerful. And so we wanted to follow that up with how God is all knowing and all present. And to do that, we're really going to be looking at one chapter in Psalm 139 today. And so let's start with God is all knowing. We're going to kind of jump around a little bit in this chapter, but to start off the chapter, David writes, "O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my laying down, and are acquainted with all of my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." And then jumping down to verse 6, he says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too high. It is high, I cannot attain it." And if we jump over several verses down, we get into the well-known verses of how God formed our inward parts, knit me together in my mother's womb. My favorite verse of this entire psalm, what I find the most encouraging, is in verse 16, where David says, "In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them." And so I think these verses in this psalm really highlight how God is all knowing. Like, he knows the words that are on our tongues before we even speak them. He wrote every single day of our life before we had days, before we had breath, before our heart began to beat, before we were even conceived. God already had a plan for our lives and had already a story written out for us.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to even comprehend that level of knowing. I think when David says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high and I cannot attain it." I heard somebody say recently that if God were to reveal everything that was to come in the future of their life, I wouldn't be able to handle that. I wouldn't be able to comprehend. I wouldn't be able to withstand knowing everything that was going to come in my life. The good, the bad, the indifferent. And I think it would, if I were to somehow know that, I think it would kind of break me. Like, I don't think I'd be able to function knowing that all these things were coming and being concerned about the coming of all those things. You think that to know the future would help relieve some anxiety, but I think that if I knew everything that was going to be coming in my life, I don't think I could handle it.
Yeah.
Being afraid of messing up the good things, being afraid of entering into the hard things.
Yeah. I think I'd try to skip all the hard things. Which kind of brings up this point that I had written down in our notes. When we talk about the verse, it says, "Every one of my days were written before there ever was one." It's verse 16. And sometimes that's comforting. It's like, man, God knows. He knew what I would go through before I went through it. But also sometimes that's hard to think about, because it means that God knew all of the hard things before they happened. And in our limited understanding, our limited knowing, we go, well, why couldn't God have skipped this part? Why couldn't I have avoided this hardship? I mean, just even a few months ago, like we went through a really rough time where, and I had asked myself, well, if God called us here, if God put us in this position, why would this bad thing have happened? Why would I have had to go through this hard thing? And, it brings up the question of, if God is so good, why do bad things happen? But at the same time, it's hopeful in that, and I'm just seeing the hope in my own personal life where it seems like this hard thing that happened that I wish I could have avoided. I wish I could go back and change it from happening. I don't understand why it had to happen. And yet this hard thing that happened kind of like cracked me open. And though I would have loved to do this any other way besides go through this hard time, God used it to crack me open so he could get to things that were deeper, things from my childhood, hurts and pains that I had suffered years and years and years ago. And he has been using this season, this hardship in our lives to bring healing to places that I didn't know still needed healing. And so, for me, if I knew all of the hard times that were coming, I would want to avoid them. I would want to skip those parts. And yet God uses the hard and the good to mold us and shape us. And sometimes the hard things we go through are for our benefit or for our healing. It doesn't make the things that have happened to us good. It means that God is doing good in the hard things and in the bad seasons and in the things that we wish we could change.
Yeah. I think that really reminds me of the story of Job.
Mm.
And Job asked God, essentially why did this happen? Because Job didn't understand it. And God's answer was essentially, you're incapable of understanding why this happened. And so certainly as I look back on my life and hard things, even this experience you were talking about, I can see God working and doing good things in that. And so there's pieces of it that I can know, and there's pieces of it that I can understand. But then the question comes, well, couldn't God have taught me that? Couldn't God have done those good things without the hard stuff?
Yeah.
And certainly he's capable of doing that. But I think the answer to that question of, well, why did you do it this way? I don't think I'm capable of understanding the answer to that.
Right.
Even if God were to tell me.
Right. Because God is all knowing.
Yeah.
And the comforting thing is we don't have to be. We don't have to know all of the answers. We don't have to know all of the reasons. That brings me to, just another point along the same lines is that we read in Jeremiah 29:11. Everybody knows that verse, but that is given to Israel when they were in Babylon, and they were captive by Babylon, and all of these prophets and everybody was saying, oh, you're not going to be here long. Like, don't get comfortable. God's going to rescue us and all this other stuff. And then God tells Jeremiah, no, like you're going to be here for a while. Tell the people to get comfortable, to build houses, to plant gardens, to have their children get married, to get comfortable. It's going to be a while. But what I love the most, and I love how the New King James writes Jeremiah 29:11, because I'm gonna mix a couple translations because I don't have this in front of me. But it's for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you. But the New King James says next, plans to give you an expected end. See, God knows his plans for us. He knows what's coming for us, and nothing can change his plans. Nothing can take away the things that he's decided. And so God plans to give us an expected end. He expects to fulfill his promises. He expects to take us to that next place. He expects to get us through and to move us forward, because he knows what's coming next, and he knows what we need to get there and how we need to get there. And so we can trust in his all-knowing nature.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to the real comfort that I find in all of this is God's presence.
Mm. Yeah.
And so yes, God is all knowing, and I can think about that and think about how awesome that is, and I can trust in that with my mind. But my emotions have a hard time sometimes with just this all knowing God. It's like, that's great. What does that do for my feelings? And I'm not a real emotional person, but when I'm feeling those emotions, the rational part of me that understands that God is all knowing isn't really that helpful. But knowing that God is all present and that God is there with me, even when I don't understand, even when I'm feeling things that I can solve with my brain, but I can't really reconcile that with my feelings and my emotions. I can know that God is there with me in that time, in that season, through that circumstance. And I can just be in his presence.
Yeah, David puts it like this in Psalm 139. Starting in verse 7, he says, "Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." So wherever we go, God is there. Whether it's heaven or if I make my where did it go? If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Like if I go down to the depths of the grave, like God's there with us in the darkest times, in the brightest times. And I was talking with someone recently about, the verse, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And how, sometimes we get in our heads, our minds, that we need to fight to follow Jesus. We need to fight to be close to Jesus. We need to run and pursue him. And I think sometimes in our lives that's true. But I also think there are times in our life where God is sitting right next to us and he's close enough that we could just tip our head onto his shoulder. And sometimes in the darkest parts of our lives, that intimacy of tipping our head onto Christ's shoulder is how we draw near to God. There's a closeness there. God is with us. Jesus is called Emmanuel, God with us. And we have the Holy Spirit with us. God is with us. We can lean on him. We can rely on him. He's always there.
Yeah. And I think that when we bring together these three huge aspects of God, his power, that he's all powerful, his knowledge, that he's all knowing, he knows everything, and that God who's all powerful and is all knowing is all present. That when we begin to understand that and let that kind of when I let that seep into my life, that is what helps me live a fearless life. Not because I will never be afraid of anything again, but because when I face fear, I have this understanding of who my God is in the face of that fear. And I can walk by faith into and through that fear, even if it may be hard, even if it may not end the way that I want it to. I know that my God, who's all powerful, is capable of doing whatever he wants to do. He's all knowing. He knows not only what's going to happen, but he knows why it's going to happen that way. And he knows what's best for me even more than I know myself. And he's going to be with me through all of it.
Yeah. I think the only way we could end better is just with one last verse, which is Jeremiah 23 through 24, where God says, "Am I a God who is near, declares the Lord, and not a God who is far off? Can a man hide himself in hiding places so I do not see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heavens and the earth, declares the Lord? God is a God who is near and not far off.
Hey everyone, this is Nick. I'm really glad you've joined us for this episode of the Fearless Society podcast. Be sure to